And that's primarily what I want to do here today is talk about restorative justice in Canada, how it is being used, and how it should increasingly be used. Um, Another point that was touched on was getting the right Crown prosecutor, and that is very important. In Canada, it is increasing in prevalence, more so in some provinces than in others. BC and Alberta are actually ahead of us in this trend. And unfortunately, Ontario, while it has been using restorative justice increasingly, has limited its use in certain offenses, has decided not to approve of any restorative justice approach for any sex assaults, even though there are multiple victims, survivors that are asking for this solution. And the two cases in Ontario where this solution was used, in both cases, the survivors reported greater levels of satisfaction with the process. And in many cases, survivors that are forced to go through trial report feelings of re-traumatization, and they're basically looking for solutions that are not being offered by the province. So what is restorative justice is kind of where I start with. For most people, I find they're not really sure exactly what it is. So with criminal justice, the traditional trial adversarial system pits the Crown against the defense, and there's little quarter given. You go to trial, and the verdict is either guilty or not. And with an acquittal, there's no accountability taken on behalf of the offender. They are proven not guilty, and that's the end of it. And in Canada, certainly the conviction rate of these cases that go to trial is far less than 20%. I think it sits around 16 to 8%, depending on the studies that are done. But in every study I've seen, it's far less than 1 in 5 that are actually convicted. And that is because we have the burden of proof, which is beyond a reasonable doubt, which in many cases is very onerous and cannot be proven by the Crown. So that's one reason to use restorative justice as an alternative to the trial system, because of the statistical rates of return when we have those kinds of outcomes. Also, survivors, as I've mentioned, report feelings of re-traumatization. They're put on the stand where they have to relive a very traumatic experience under scrutiny of cross-examination, which is very rigorous and is frequently designed to destroy the credibility of the witness, trying to pick them apart for any discrepancy in their recollection of events. And as they've just lived through a very traumatic experience, the effects of, post-traumatic stress disorder can have debilitating effects on one's ability to recall these events. And when everything hinges on the person's recall, again, we see the problems with the system as is. Now, I'm not saying that restorative justice should be used in every case. And there are certainly a lot of cases where it wouldn't be appropriate, primarily in any case where the survivor of a crime does not want to go through the process of restorative justice. It's an automatic no. So this is only for those cases where the survivor themselves is asking for this approach. And that is still an overwhelming number of cases. The problem with our current system is that the state assumes the role of the victim. And once that happens, victim input frequently doesn't have a significant effect on trial outcomes or even in sentencing. And what I mean by that is when a victim or survivor indicates their level of trauma and more or less is advocating for a harsher sentence, frequently that is considered as an aggravating factor that would increase the sentence that the perpetrator is likely to receive. However, when the survivor is asking for leniency, is explaining their relationship to the offender, is trying to give some cultural context, I frequently see this kind of input not being considered, sometimes not making its way into court, and even when it is, um, it doesn't have the sort of mitigating effects that these survivors would hope to have. And the real tragedy in this is in not having those mitigating effects, it also denies both the survivor and the perpetrators the ability to heal and to restore themselves. And this is really at the heart of restorative justice, is this notion of healing and repair. Because criminal justice traditionally asks what law has been broken, who broke the law, and what the punishment should be. Whereas restorative justice looks at the harm and who's accountable and how the harm can be best repaired. And so with restorative justice, it becomes transformative as, like many of the Indigenous traditions across Canada, see that when these harms are done, it is harming to both the survivors and the one who caused the harm. In this interconnected web of social interactions, when a harm is caused, it ripples out and harms everybody involved. So therefore, repairing the harm needs to focus on bringing in many community members beyond just the perpetrator and the survivor of the event. So family members are frequently involved, friends can be involved, caseworkers, community support workers. There's really no limit to how large the circle can be, so long as everybody involved in the circle has a vested interest in the outcome and is genuinely willing to participate. So that's basically what it looks like at a broad level. There's different forms of restorative justice, different kinds of circles. There's a transformative justice from Central South America that really focuses on the transformative aspect of the offender and how to engage with that person so that they are healed in a way that makes it unlikely or less likely for these offenses, for these situations to continue to recur. I mentioned sentencing circles, which in North America happen after the sentence has been passed down from a court. So this can even happen after a trial. So it is possible to go to a trial with the adversarial system and then be found guilty and then still use the sentencing circle, but it's less remunerative than if you had a healing circle that happens before the trial and we take the possibility of incarceration off the table. This allows people to engage more openly with the process and to more freely accept accountability and responsibility rather than it being something that is imposed and sort of positioned after the fact to mitigate sentencing. It can happen before the trial and actually save the survivor the discomfort, the agony of having to go through with a trial. Now, there are many different offenses that restorative justice is appropriate for. Assaults, see, interpersonal or intimate partner violence in Ontario is one of those categories where the Crown will not consider restorative justice. Even though the transformative justice that came out of Central South America was founded largely by survivors, women of these situations involving men who themselves were the subject of colonial oppression. And this was being manifested in the social relationships. And what the community needed more than incarceration was healing, because when the justice system intervened to take away these young Black men from their homes and families, it created a social vacuum that led to a lack of resources within the community and left the community with even less of an ability to restore and rebuild itself. And so we are seeing those same sorts of situations in Indigenous populations here in Canada and in some of the marginalized and underrepresented populations that experience these greater levels of poverty and greater patterns of violence. So we need to go into these communities with more of a healing approach that can give everybody involved the skills and the tools they need to have better social interactions, better social relationships, and come up with solutions that will bring resources into the community rather than taking these resources away from the community and leading to more cycles of oppression and violence. So I'm hoping everyone here can take what I'm saying into the community and advocate for alternative justice measures. I find these lectures usually leave more questions than they answer, but I'm certainly around to field anything if anybody has anything. Okay, I see a raise hands. Okay.
I have a question, if I may.
Of course, go
Yes,
ahead.
please.
I'm just curious, take the question in a different direction. What took you into this particular corner of the legal profession? It's a little different. I thank you for what you do. You had a most interesting presentation, but I'm kind of wondering what took you into this in the first place.
Well, I myself grew up in a fairly marginalized community and really saw firsthand the effects of the incarceral system and how there was, a lot of crime and poverty in my neighborhood. And as I grew, I wanted to make some sort of a difference, some sort of an impact. And I thought the best way to do that would become a lawyer. And as I was studying to become a lawyer, I took sociology and focused on crime and deviance and studied about restorative justice and in youth deviance and understanding what makes the most significant impact. And I learned early on that the most significant impacts are seen in youth, are seen in first-time offenders or in people who have minimal engagement, have had minimal engagement with the criminal justice system. It becomes more difficult the more people have become entrenched in that system. And as I was learning about this, I started learning about restorative justice and diversion and alternative measures as ways of keeping people out of those jails and out of those traditional systems that seem to be, for the most part, making things worse in terms of the overall rates of success. And so I took that from my degree in sociology when I went to law school and then continued learning about restorative justice and attending the Anishinaabe Law Camp and learning more about the indigenous traditions and native law and how restorative justice really in Canada gets its origins largely from these indigenous traditions. So I teach from a multicultural perspective and I incorporate those indigenous beliefs as well as the beliefs from other parts of the world to try to come up with something that's truly restorative and can be applied by anyone.